But I think at the end of the day, you guys are going to feel really good about what's going on as we kind of finish up the class here. So, all right, so let's get rolling. All right, let me move this forward. All right, and here we go. At the end of the day, you guys got a little feedback because of YouTube. All right, so last class, what did we do? We derived the aggregate demand curve, okay? So there'll be 50 questions on the final. Let me deal with that in about 60 minutes, okay? All right, so last class, we derived the aggregate demand curve. So how did this actually work? What was the motivation for this? Well, we said, look, we can go ahead and be in a equilibrium in the money market, right? That money market is an equilibrium because money demand is driven by the price P1, right? That's a function of the price, right? Money supply is dictated by the Fed, and then we've got an interest rate, an equilibrium interest rate of R1 that really determines or helps determine, right, what happens to AE, how high or low that's going to be, right? And then we know that model very well, and that equilibrium will be at E1 and Y1, right? And then we can go ahead and project this equilibrium in the spending market and this price level right here in the money market onto another graph, okay? So that gives us this point Z1. Now, I'm going to just derive this really quickly and just go through what happens when prices fall. Okay, what happens when prices fall? Well, it's still going a little slow here. I guess it's always updating at this time these days, all right? Okay, so what happens when prices fall? We go from P1 to P2, which really means that our money demand shifts left. The reason we know this is because we don't need as much cash on hand to buy the things that we need as we did before. So then we're going to see that money demand from households go from MD1 to MD2, and there's price 2. Okay, so then this will take us to R2, right? So we'll have a decrease in R. Okay, so we'll see that price level go down, money demand shift left, decrease that interest rate. That lower interest rate will make purchasing goods and services that are big, right? Big ticket items, cars, yachts, firms buying new capital. That's going to start to go up. So we'll say that we see an increase in planned investment spending and autonomous consumption, which leads to an increase in aggregate expenditures. So we're going to lift this up. And notice what I'm going to do here is I'm going to denote this. Let's see, can I do that well? Yeah, that's pretty good. As AE2 R2, right? So this new AE curve, right, will have an interest rate of R2 attached to it, right, which is lower than R1. We've lifted up AE. We've got this new equilibrium at E2. Okay, so now we're here at Y2. So what we have now is we have a new combination of prices and this equilibrium output Y equals AE, which is now Y2. So we have a new Y equal to Y2, which is greater than Y1. So prices have gone down, right, from P1 to P2. And then we've got our equilibrium level of Y going from Y1 to Y2. It's going up, right? So now we can just go ahead and project that down here. We're here at Y2. And then we can go ahead and just call this P2 right here, okay? So this would be point Z1, or Z2 rather, sorry. So what we've done is we've taken all of that information and we've said, all that information from the first two graphs and said, we can just plot these points, right? Let's plot Z1, price 1, giving us interest rate 1, giving us AE1, giving us Y1. And then we've got price 2, R2, and I can go ahead and put B right here for completeness, right? Giving us this new equilibrium interest rate, giving us this new AE curve, giving us this new Y. Now we've got this new Y2, price 2 combination. So we can do that for every price level, and that's essentially what we did last class. Boy, I'm going to have to redo that one. That's a big miss there, little too big. Let's go with that's a little bit better, not a ton better, but big enough dots will do it. All right, so what we can do here is we can map out this curve, which we call the aggregate demand curve, AD, which gives us equilibrium in these other two markets, right? So the power of that curve is really strong, and we can just move along this curve by changing the price, So changing, and we had this written out last class, but changing price, move along AD, right? Just like before, right? Just like before, when we were talking about demand curves and literally week 1, week 2, right? So we're coming all the way back to our roots here, okay? Is this like the pandemic occurring? Not quite yet. When we're gonna implement the pandemic more directly in just a second. We'll do it through the Great Recession. It's going to have the same type of implication. But what you're thinking about now is you might be thinking about like the price changes or the inflation that we're seeing right now and the implications of that. We'll talk about that a little bit as well, given if we got a little bit of time for that for sure. Okay, so we've got our aggregate demand curve though, right? We've got this curve and we can move along it. The thing that we need to really understand is what shifts AD. Right, so let's get ourselves rolling here, right? And let me ask you guys, right? What shifts AD? I can ask this a lot of different ways, right? I can say, what changes Y, right? Our equilibrium level of Y, other than price P. Right, so in this first example here, we've changed price, and that's changed our interest rate, changed our Y, AE, and then Y, right? But that moves us along this AD curve. Tell me what shifts it. In other words, what's going to change our equilibrium level of Y equals AE, other than price, right? Other than price. So give this a try here, right? Open-ended question, right? And let's see what kind of answers we can get here.
That's a game that I hate to lose, and I'm feeling the strain. Ain't it a shame? Oh, give me the Beach Boys and free my soul. I wanna get lost in your rock and roll and drift away. Oh, give me the Beach Boys and free my soul. I wanna get lost in your rock and roll and drift away. Think that I'm wasting time. I don't understand the things I do.
All right. So what do we get here, right? Just again, answering these questions here. Can scroll up just a little bit here. Like I said, we're moving fast here just because I want to make sure we get through everything. But we'll obviously have that review session on Saturday to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, so what do we get as a set of answers here? All right, let's see. Right, we've got income. Sort of. Income is like the outcome of this, right? That is changing, right? That's what we want to change, right? When income changes, right? But what's causing that income change? Interest rate is a great example. Supply is a little bit funky because supply is actually, we're going to bring in this aggregate supply curve in the next slide, right? And when we move this aggregate supply, we will go ahead and move along the aggregate demand curve to a new equilibrium. So its price is going to change at the same time, and we'll see that come together. Okay, what else do we got here? Yes, so, COVID. Yes, absolutely COVID. We can think about maybe the feelings about unemployment, depression, tax changes, right? Autonomous consumption, that's huge. This is really big because if we change autonomous consumption for some reason other than the price, yes, we are going to end up changing that AE curve directly, but prices won't have changed. Let's see, and taxes are really coming in. This is really good. So government spending is another one. Yes. Future expectations, yes, that will do it too. The Omicron variant, right? Where we got this new variant. I mean, we're running out of Greek letters at this point, right? Like, I don't know what's next, right? We're gonna have to go to a new language setting or something. We go to like a computer language. It'll be like computer code. So at any rate, right, what's going to shift AD, right? Let's go ahead and really pick out the big things that are going to shift AD, right? The answer, right, the big answer, right, kind of the all-encompassing answer is anything that changes our AE other than price, right? Other than price, right? So price, right? When price changes, right? All those things change that we saw up above, right? Money demand, interest rate, AE, Y, right? And then that maps us from say P1 to P2. But if we change aggregate expenditures, move it up or down, and it's not because of price, well, now all of a sudden we've got a new Y, but we don't have a new price, right? We got the same price. And AD is that aggregate demand, right? That's that aggregate demand right here, right? So, okay. So, right, let's talk about this, or let's at least show this here, right? So when we draw our aggregate demand curve right now, and you guys are starting to see the simplicity really kind of come back, right? The benefit of all the work that we've done so far, right? Come back. And when I say price, what do we mean when we say price? I mean like the general level of prices, right? The general level of prices changing, right? Of say the CPI, right? That will change how much money we need on hand versus how much we'll put into other things, right? In terms of money demand. Okay. So our AD curve, though, right? We can map out an AD curve here. Right, let's write this out here. So there's AD, aggregate demand 1. And let's say that at this point, right, we can start here at Z1 and say at price level 1, we've got Y1, right? That's going to be our equilibrium, and Y equals AE, that AE model. Okay. So then when we think about shifters, right? Shifters of this aggregate demand curve, I really like that interest rate came up, and I really like that taxes came up. And the reason I like that is because we can think of these as policy shifters, right? Policy shifters of aggregate demand, right? So if we think back just a couple weeks ago, right, one policy shifter is fiscal policy, right? And when we talk about fiscal policy, so when you say P is price, but what is Y in the aggregate demand curve? Y is that equilibrium and income and GDP that we've thought about it. That's what we thought about the entire time, right? The entire year, right? And that's going to be our Y right here, right? That's going to be our Y, that all-encompassing Y. So, but to this point with fiscal policy, right? So we could say, well, what happens if we increase G or decrease T, right? Those two answers popped up, right? If those two things happen, we're going to see our aggregate expenditure curve go up, just like it did a couple weeks ago, right? When we said what happens when the government starts spending more, we just lift that curve up. There's a multiplier effect. We can talk about all that, right? We can talk about the debt that goes into that as well, or the deficit that's added to that, right? But we're going to just lift up AE, right? We could also go the opposite direction, decrease G or increase T, and we'll see AE go down, right? We'll see AE go down, right? Just like it did a couple weeks ago, right? Both of these things, right, will change our equilibrium Y equals AE, but price is unchanged, at least initially, So what I mean by that, let's go ahead and let's make the government go out and spend a lot more money. If they spend a lot more money and lift up AE, now all of a sudden we could be at Y2 right here, but the price is no different than it was, right? So when the government just starts spending more on, say, like parks, right, or gives raises to teachers or national defense, anything like that, it's not like all of a sudden the gas prices go up because of that, right? But there might be more spending initially, right? There might be a higher equilibrium Y from Y1 to Y2, right? But prices are the same. So now our new AD curve goes through this combination of price, P1, and then Y2. We're just shifting AD from AD1 to AD2, right? So this would be because we have an increase in G or a decrease in T, right? Conversely, right, let's complete the story, right? If we say that, well, the government decides to spend less or they decide to tax more, that's just going to push AE down, right? We're going to be pushing AE down, and we're going to end up at a lower Y, actually on a line here, right? Go down to Y3, and now our AD curve would run through AD3, would be AD3 because we run through the same price level, but a lower level of output because now all of a sudden the government stopped spending, right, or spent less, right? So this would be a decrease in G or an increase in T. Both of these things will shift AD to the left, okay, shift AD to the left. And so we can color code this and say this red line representing that shift left or reduction in AD, aggregate demand, right? The blue line, that's going to be a shift to the right, okay? So that's going to be one of our policy shifters, and that's why, again, I was happy to see taxes come up really early, and then eventually we saw the government spending as well, okay? So that's one shifter, right? That's one shifter in terms of a policy. What came up right away, which you have to know, it makes me really happy to see, is Jurgen said, "Wait, what about monetary policy? Don't sleep on monetary policy." I'm not. I promise. I wasn't going to let that go, right? So that's the other type of policy, right? Because we didn't spend a couple of weeks talking about the money market and monetary policy, and then just say, "Oh, let's forget about it at the end of the term." No, it's right here, right? And it's going to be just as important as it always has been. And so we've got two things that we can do with monetary policy. The Fed can go out and they can buy bonds. They can go out and increase that money supply, decrease that interest rate, increase AE, and then have that shift in the AD curve to the right. Because again, them going out and buying bonds, that's not changing the price level today, right? When those bonds are bought, right, and that interest rate goes down, it's not like all of a sudden the car just became more expensive, right? When we see that increase in the money supply, decrease in the interest rate, an increase in autonomous consumption, planned investment spending, it takes some time before we start to see any type of price change as a result of that. So what happens? We end up essentially at this Z2 point again. So we could say if we increase the money supply or buy bonds, that will certainly increase that AD curve, okay? So we can think of both monetary and fiscal policy as having control over that AD curve, right? So we just said that, hey, the federal government, they can increase or decrease G or T. Well, the Fed can increase or decrease that money supply by buying and selling bonds. They can increase that interest rate if they decrease the money supply. That'll suppress or reduce autonomous consumption, planned investment spending, right? And then we'll see that AD curve go to that left, right? We'll have a lower level of output Y, right? But the price level won't initially change. So writing this out, we'll say Y changes, right? That Y equals AE, that AE line is changing, right? But there is no change in price initially, okay? So, and I'll go ahead and color code these again because I think it's instructive, right? So we've got that increase in the money supply, shifting AD to the right. That's going to be blue in this case, right? We can shift AD to the left, right, by going out and selling those bonds, reducing that money supply, okay? So those are two really big, important shifters of that AD curve, right? Now, there's tons of other things in there, and you saw me get excited about the expectations, even the Omicron variant, right? And we can go ahead and say that, right? What about other shifters, right? And I'm going to give myself more space because this is electronic, so why not? There we go. There we go. Okay, so other shifters, well, yeah, we could certainly say the pandemic, right? What did the pandemic do? Lockdowns, reduction in lots of spending. We saw that throughout the term. We had a nice little website about that, right? That said, hey, there's a lot less spending than before on everything other than groceries, and those are starting to flatten out a little bit, right? But there's been a lot of things that have reduced that spending as a result of the pandemic. Unemployment came up in the chat. Now, unemployment, I want you to think of unemployment as a consequence, right? And we'll think of it as saying, hey, the something like the pandemic, right? That shifted AD to the left. We have this reduction in output Y. That reduction, if this is Y bar, right? This distance right here, if that's your new equilibrium, that's going to be your cyclical unemployment right there, right? That distance. So that you can think of unemployment as an outcome, right? A consequence of this reduction in AD. You could also have something like well shocks, right? So what if everybody's housing value goes up? What about stocks? What about the stock market running or not running, right? And people get really emotional about it, right? Because they're saying, geez, stock market I think went down on Friday by, I don't know, 3 or 4%. And that really caused waves in the market, and people weren't celebrating this reduction in their wealth. You could just say more generally, anything that influences autonomous consumption or planned investment spending or net exports, all of those things will directly affect AE. But when people get excited and want to go out and spend a bunch of money, not necessarily changing the price that day. You may be saying, eventually, shouldn't the prices change because we're like missing out on equilibrium? We absolutely are, and that's where we're headed next. So what I want you to take out of this, right? And this is essentially we're getting to kind of the most complex part of the course, is that we've got three markets here, right? One of them is half baked right now. We'll complete it. We've got equilibrium in the money market. We've got equilibrium in this Y equals AE spending market, aggregate expenditures, spending, right? And then we've got this price and then income output relationship, right? So Y being that income or output or production, right? There's a relationship between price and this output here. Does AE shift AD? Are they proportional? Yeah, so we can think about this level of Y1 is associated with this one, this level of Y2 associated with this, right? So, and we could say, hey, what if AE, and we'll do this in a little bit, what if AE shifted up for a reason other than price? Well, now we would just move our AD right over here, okay? Diamond, what a great question. So will a pandemic also cause a shift in aggregate supply or just demand? This is like a shift in everything. It's just, the shift is hitting the fan. We'll put it that way, right? That's like an old man joke there. I had to say it though. It was organic. Yeah, it's going to cause a lot of problems. Like this is yeah. Let me bring that up there. So okay, so let's get to aggregate supply, right? So we can address that whole market right there. Okay. So let's, well, I got to shift in AD, right? But let's complete this market, right? Let's add, and I'll write it this way. Let's add the other side of the market. Now, we don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but what we can say is that our aggregate demand curve represented consumer spending, right? So it said, hey, when the prices are a certain amount, this is how much people are going to spend. That's where Y equals AE. We're going to get this AE amount, right? So spending and output will be in equilibrium at these particular price and Y combinations, okay? But what we've kind of ignored, right? And it's been kind of subtle, right? And it's been kind of subtle throughout this entire term, but we need to ask, how will firms change production, right? Their production level Y in response to the general level of prices P, right? So we can think of this CPI, right? So if we think about the CPI going up or down, we would imagine that firms are going to respond to that somewhat strongly, because if the price of something is going up that is being sold by a firm, they're going to want to produce more of it, right? Because they're saying, hey, it might be costly to produce more, but if the price is high, yeah, that's actually, we'll certainly do that, right? So it's profitable to continue to do that. As the price goes down, though, right? Think about, we were talking about drilling for oil. If the price of oil, which is not going down, right? If that goes down, people aren't going to want to spend a lot of money on drills, right? They're going to say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do something else or not produce as much oil because it's not worth the cost that it takes to drill given what that current price is. So what I would say is that just recall from, honestly, weeks 1 and 2, right? Weeks 1 and 2, that the quantity supplied, remember that quantity supplied again of gasoline or whatever market that you're comfortable with or kind of resonates the most with you, right? That quantity supplied is the amount that each firm is willing and able to produce at a particular price level. So what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate this concept to the entire industry and to all firms. And you can almost think of it as like the ultimate average firm, right? The ultimate average firm, or we think of it as all firms together, right? Either way, whatever seems to fit best, that will be depicted by an aggregate supply curve. And we see that up on the screen here, and we've seen it up for a couple minutes, right? But all we have to do is just adjust our definition of supply and say that this is the amount of production in the entire economy, Y, right? Instead of that quantity, it's going to be that Y, total amount of production, right, that all firms produce at various price levels. Okay. All right. So just like we did with kind of lots of the second half of markets throughout the term, what's nice about this is that we can say, we really kind of went into demand, right? There's a lot going on in each of those points there, right? That aggregate demand curve is very dense, very important. This aggregate supply curve, not that it's not important, but ultimately it's going to mimic those supply curves that we've seen throughout the term. So we can think of that supply curve as just being an upward sloping curve, and we'll say aggregate supply is just that right there, right? AS1 right there. So this aggregate supply curve, again, is saying that as prices rise, firms are willing to produce more, all right? So if we're here at, let's say, P1 and Y1, that was, everything just wants to update, go figure, right? So we're here at P1 and Y1, right? We can call this Z low right here, right? So we're at this low level of output. Firms are only needing to charge P1, right? Or whatever story you want to tell. If the prices go down to P1, firms are only going to produce Y1. But then if we go up to Y2, all right, well, it must be that firms are able to charge P2, right, a high amount here, and go up to Z high, right? So increasing that price moves us along that curve, that AS curve, right? Is there any reason we use Z? For the same reason that we use any letter, that we're trying to essentially separate the Z, right, from the other markets, right? We don't want to necessarily have the A and the B or the E in this particular graph here, so we don't get confused. So we can think of Z as being the AS-AD curves. Okay, so we've got this movement along AS when prices change. Okay, so again, you can kind of guess where this is headed, right? What happens? So what's going to actually shift this curve? Right? What's actually going to shift this curve? So we can move along the curve by changing the price, but what's going to shift our AS curve? Now, I'm not going to ask you guys a question about this just for time's sake, right? But we can go ahead and think, if this is that one of those points where if we were in person, you'd be kind of yelling out loud. What about the cost of inputs, right? What about wages or the cost of capital? Yeah, absolutely. What about technology? Yeah, sure. Right. What about the number of firms? Right. In the market, right? In the entire economy. What about expectations? What about regulations? Right. What about supply chain? Right. What if one part of your supply chain gets disrupted? Now you're not going to be able to produce as much, right? There's just not the ability for firms to do that. Okay. So when we think about the aggregate supply curve, again, we can think about it just like we did our gasoline market. We just have to aggregate it for the entire economy, but there's nothing really remarkable or new about how we proceed with it, right? We've just got an upward sloping curve, right? And if we want to move along it, prices have to change. But then if we have something like technology, and I'll put this in blue here, right? If we have technology, right, technology improvements, well, all this is going to do is just shift AS1 to AS2, right? And this would be our increase in supply, all right? If we have something like a supply chain disruption like we're seeing quite often these days, well, we're going to see AS1 go to AS3. We're going to see this reduction in our supply AS curve or aggregate supply. So this would be our decrease in supply. Okay. So what this is depicting is, are firms actually willing to produce the amount that people want to buy at the given price? So hopefully you're kind of sitting there saying like, yeah, so you give me one side of the market, AD. Yeah, it's kind of complicated, but okay, we can work with that. And now you've got AS. We need to, yeah, where's the demand? Like, let's put demand in this. So let's draw the graph that you are going to go home during the holidays and brag to everybody about and say, you know what? I actually learned something. Like, look at what I can do. All right. So, and we'll get to these shifts in just a second. Kind of bring this all together, right? So I could say, hey, price level today is 100, right? M1 is equal to 1 trillion, right? So you guys are already thinking about those graphs that can represent that, right? I can tell you what the interest rate is. That's 5%. And let's say that we're at Y bar equal to 10,000, our good old full employment level of output. Okay, right? So, all right. So this is just an AS curve. That's just the straight upward sloping curve. We're just shifting left or right. Okay. All right. So let's depict this economy, right, with all the information that we've learned about this term, right? So the first thing that we'll do, right, is we'll draw the money market, right, just individually. I'm not going to draw anything else right now. I'm going to say we got money, we've got the interest rate, and we've got a money demand curve right here, MD1, that's a function of prices equaling 100, okay? And actually, I'll move that, just put P1 right there, okay? We've got a money supply curve that is set by the Federal Reserve, MS1. There's the Fed. And then we've got M1 equal to 1 trillion. Okay. So we're at point A. We're at equilibrium at R1 equal to 5% in that money market. Okay. All right. So that equilibrium in the money market of 5%, again, dictates where that aggregate expenditure curve will be. So hopefully you're saying, gosh, writing this all out and drawing this all out, right, this is actually really dense and really complicated, but actually just doing that, right, actually getting everything written down and drawn out is actually going to be just one of the greatest study tools that you have, right? If you can explain everything along the way and say we're at equilibrium, 5% in that money market, that's going to give us our 5% interest rate. That's going to give us AE, and I'm going to put a bar over it because representing full employment level of output, and I'll put R equal to 5% here, okay? And then we've got Y bar right here, because that's what I said the equilibrium was, E bar right here. Right, so we felt somewhat comfortable about these two markets for a couple weeks now, right? But what we've done is we've said, look, we can just project this down onto a single graph, right, where we have AS and AD, right? So we've got Y and we've got P. And so here, we've got Y bar equal to 10,000, and we've got P1 equal to 100. We know that we're at this point here. AD has to run through here, right? AD has to run through. I'm going to put a Z1 right there, right? And the reason AD has to run through there, that aggregate demand curve, is because, right, that aggregate demand curve is showing the combinations of equilibrium in this market and this market simultaneously, okay? So we've got AD running through here. So we'll call it AD bar. Okay, and I'll put a bar over this too. All right. So in order for us to truly be in an equilibrium, though, there has to be no pressure on the prices to change. So firms have to be willing to produce 10,000 units at a price level of 100. So that means that the aggregate supply curve has to go through this point. We'll call it AS bar, right? And so once the aggregate supply curve is drawn like this, it is telling us that at a price level of 100, the amount of MD, right, money demand is this much, interest rate is 5%, AE is this much, Y bar is equal to 10,000, P1, right, that's that 100, that's 10,000, that's our AD curve. But it's also saying that firms at this price of 100 are willing and able to produce 10,000 units. They don't want to produce more, they don't want to produce less, right? They're in an equilibrium in terms of their decision making there. And there's no pressure on prices anymore because 10,000 units are bought, 10,000 units are produced, price level is 100. We are in complete macro equilibrium here. Complete macro equilibrium here. So there's three graphs because this is a complicated market because the two graphs at the top dictate or determine that AD curve right here. Now we're going to drop those two other graphs in just a second, but I want to, and you'll see this on the screen, right? So we've got just a blank graph right here, right? That's what we're going to eventually get to, right? But we've got this entire macroeconomy, right? We're going to just work with AD and AS in just a second, but we need to know that there's more going on in the background. Okay, so what I want to ask you guys, right, is I want you to put on your analyst hats, and I want to ask you guys what happens when there's a housing market crash, right? So, and you can actually put pandemic in this as well, right? But if there's a housing crash, what's the consequence of this, right? What's the consequence of this? So kind of work through this, right? Think about what shifts first, what happens next, what happens next, what happens next, right? And what's our final outcome in terms of this ASAD model, okay? So give this a try, right? And we'll come back in a minute or so. This is the apex of complexity, guys.
You can smile, every smile for the man who held your hand neath the pale moonlight. But don't forget who's taking you home and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, save the last dance for me. Oh I know that the music's fine like sparkling wine. Go and have your fun. Laugh and sing, but while we're apart, don't give your heart to anyone. But don't forget who's taking you home and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, say the last dance for me. Baby, don't you know I love you so? Can't you feel it when we touch? I will never, never let you go. I love you oh so much. You can dance, go and carry on till the night is gone.
All right. So I'll explain this and open it back up, right? I'll open it back up and we can talk through this and walk through this, right? But let's kind of take this step by step, right? This is the most complex thing I can ask you, right? We have reached, again, this is the apex of complexity here. Let's walk through it. So when there's a housing crash, well, what's the first shock? It's not like all of a sudden the price at the grocery stores change, right? The price of gasoline doesn't change. Housing market might go down, or there might be a reduction in prices. You may have less wealth, right? But that's not going to be projected with prices right off the bat, okay? So we can think of the housing market being problematic, right? But I want you to, again, think of P as this general level of all prices. So the first shock that we're going to see is a reduction, not in prices, but a reduction in wealth, right? And so you're not going to come home from work and learn that the value of your home has been cut in half and then go out to dinner, You're going to say, oh gosh, I was planning on selling that and then, using some funds to retire or something like that. I don't know what I'm going to do now, right? So we've got this reduction in wealth that's going to lead to this decrease in autonomous consumption. It's also going to lead to this reduction in new home development if this is going to persist, right? We're not going to have new homes being bought. This will be represented by a reduction in planned investment spending. In other words, we're going to see AE drop right away, right? So AE is going to go down. So now we're going to see a new AE right here. I'm going to call it AE2 and put R 5%. Okay, so interest rate hasn't changed, but now we're here at E2, we're here at Y2. This was that unemployment that was mentioned a little bit earlier. Now we're below our full employment level of output. Now we have some cyclical unemployment because people are spending less, but we also have this new equilibrium in our AD-AS market because now we're here at AD2. Now I'm moving things a little bit quickly. I'm kind of skipping a step. I go through it in the book. You guys can look at it, but ultimately I'm kind of just jumping straight to the finish line here and saying, hey, we're down here. We shifted AD left because prices don't initially change, right? And we can see that, we can draw this. Yeah, we'll just do this. We'll say, look, we're going over this way. So we have a decrease in Y, but prices still at P1. So this means that we decrease or we shift AD left, right? So we can think of this as 0.1 right here. This is 0.1. This right here is 0.2. So now all we have to do is let the graph do the work for us. So we go from Z1 to Z2, and we see that equilibrium price go from P1 to P2, and we see Y go from Y1, Y bar to Y2, right? And so what's the final outcome that we get? We get a reduction in prices and a reduction in output. We see that right here with point B. So seeing this, you guys are right on it. Oh, no, prices don't run. No, hold on. It's actually D. We wanted you guys. I got excited, but I got a little ahead of myself. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get everybody too excited. Those who put D, right, are exactly right. And again, the reason that they're right is because they can see, all right, well, we've got this reduction in AE. AD goes left. Now we've just got a new equilibrium at Z2 instead of Z bar. So now at Z2, we're at a lower price level and we're at a lower level of output. Okay. So there's so much going on in the background, right, that can kind of make this a little confusing, right? So what we can do, and right, so you guys have put in the work. You've said, okay, I've kind of dug through all these graphs. I'm getting a little like my eyes are getting a little glazed over from all this. Is there a way that we can simplify this? And there is, right? So okay, so question comes up. So prices rising play a part in the housing crash and are a result of it. That's a bigger question and a great question, right? So if the bubble in the housing market, you get this bubble, this thing going up and up and up, and then it crashes, right? What ultimately happened, right? You could say, well, prices rising could have caused this bubble, caused this overvaluation of housing, and then this subsequent reduction in prices of housing, right? But if we think about that's just its own market, right? So it would be the prices of housing going up and then coming down that led to this shock in this market. Okay, the entire market, right? The entire market. So let's simplify this though, right? Let's simplify this, right? Let's simplify the analysis and let's just isolate our AS-AD curves, okay? So what we could do then is say, let's redo this analysis really quickly, and it can be really quickly, and we can say we've got Y, we've got P, we're in this initial equilibrium right here, right, at AD bar, and then we've got Y bar, or AS bar, we've got Z bar, and we've got Y bar, and we've got P1 equal 100, this Y bar is 10,000, okay? But what I just asked you guys is I said, hey, we've got a housing market crash, right? So this housing crash, or again, we can think of it as the pandemic, right? We can say the pandemic would reduce AC, could reduce planned investment spending as well, right? So we have a housing crash that leads to this reduction in AC, planned investment spending, reduce AE, ultimately reduce AD, shift left. People want to spend less, right? People want to spend less. So we go from AD bar to AD2. Nope, we don't need to bar over it because we're no longer there. Go to AD2, and now we're here at Z2. So what happened? Prices went down, Y went down. Okay. So, right, simple way to do that. So what's going on in the background is all of this stuff, right? All of this stuff is going on in the background. We did all this work, right? So we know that when we just show this simple AD-AS graph that we've been essentially familiar with since week 2, gosh, this isn't so bad now, right? The entire housing crash can be condensed into this right here. But you know what else can be condensed into this? How should the government or the Federal Reserve respond, right? So how should policymakers react, right? Well, in order to guide us in their reaction, what we can do, what we can return to, is we can look at our goals. What are our goals in the class? Our goals are equal to full employment. So what do we mean by full employment? We mean we want to be at Y bar, right? We want to be at Y bar. So we can ask ourselves, well, what can policymakers do to get us back to Y bar? Also, one of our goals is stable prices, right? So we had the high level of, or high, you can think of high standard of living, right? But we also had full employment. We also had stable prices. So we could say P1 equals 100. So is there anything that the government can do to get us back to Y bar and back to P1, right? So is there a policy that moves the economy back to Y bar and P1 equal 100, right? I'm going to ask you guys, right? What should the Federal Reserve in particular do, right? So let's give this a try here, right? After the housing market crash, the Fed wants to bring the economy back to full employment and maintain stable prices. What should they do, right? What should they do?
Hello there, my old friend. Not so long ago, it was till the end. We played outside in the pouring rain. On our way up the road, we started over again. You're living our dreams, oh, you on top. My mind is aching, Lord, it won't stop. That's how it's happened, living life by the drop. Up and down that road and I worn out shoes. Talking about good things and singing the blues. You went your way and I stayed behind. We both knew it was just a matter of time.
All right. So I'm gonna let this time go out, but start to talk about this response and the appropriate response to this. So Z is just the equilibriums, right? So we go from Z bar to Z2, right? The Fed wants to move us back to Z bar, right? They want to get back to Z bar because at that point we're at full employment equilibrium, right? Full employment level of output, but then we're also at this stable price level, right? So what do they need to do? They would like to shift or move AD2 back to AD bar, right? So they want to increase AD. Well, how do they increase AD? Well, in order to do that, they've got to lift up or increase AE. Well, how do they lift up AE? Well, they've got to somehow decrease those interest rates, right? Decrease R, which will increase our autonomous consumption and planned investment spending. But again, they can't just dictate those interest rates go down. They need to go out and they need to increase that money supply. But again, they don't just increase the money supply. They go out and they buy bonds, right? So are you guys ready to work at the Fed? I think you might be. Oh yeah, yeah. You guys, we got a lot of people ready to work at the Fed. You're seeing this, right? You're seeing if they go out and they buy all the things. I like that, Jeff. Go out and buy, right? Buy bonds, right? And other things, right? If we go out and we buy bonds, what will happen? We'll shift AD to the right. We'll move ourselves back to Z bar. We'll have achieved both the goals, right? We'll achieve both the goals of full employment and stable prices, right? So, and we could have increased G, we could have decreased T, right? But with this kind of like eliminates the whole debt deficit idea. So we can just say, look, this is just the Fed going out and buying or selling bonds. In this case, they buy bonds, right? All they're doing is they're countering, right? And they're countering the AD shock, right? If AD decreases, the Fed increases AD by going out and buying bonds. If AD was to increase, right, and don't draw this will just get kind of out of control real quick. I'm just going to delete it, right? We can imagine that AD, if it's up to here and we're up at Z3, right, the Fed should just say, hey, let's go ahead and sell bonds. Let's pare this back, right, and reduce AD3 back to AD bar, right? So like I said, I'm going to just erase that, right? But we could have just done the exact opposite of what we just saw here, okay? So if AD goes up, right, and goes beyond Y bar, prices start to rise, well, the Fed just has to decrease AD, right? We could also say, right, that the federal government, right, this is just information, right, the federal government can also respond to an AD shock, right? And they can counter the shocks in the same way, right, with different tools, right? So what are those tools? We know those tools, right? If AD goes down, right, the government can go ahead and increase G or decrease T. If AD gets up, gets a little heated, the government can reduce spending or they can increase taxes. So G can go down or we can go ahead and increase taxes. All right. So all we've got to do is counter that AD shock, right? That's all we've got to do if there's this aggregate demand shock, right? So this is just, yeah, so Audrey's hitting it right on the head, right? This is just like demand and supply, but we're just doing it on like an entire, like a bigger scale. That's all it is. We're kind of back to our roots, right? So we have all this stuff going on in the background, but we can simplify it by just looking at this ASAD model, right? So it's really, really kind of cool that we can take all that complication and just put it into something fairly straightforward, right? Fairly straightforward. So real quickly before I get on to supply shocks, I'm gonna ask you a question about that, right? We can go ahead as economists and, we can pump our own tires and say how great we are at modeling things and, look at how amazing we are. What we need to do is we actually need to show that these things happen, right? So we can go ahead and say, did this housing market crash actually cause this price level to go down? Did it cause output to go down? What happened to government spending afterwards? Did they respond correctly? What about tax revenue? What about interest rates? Did the money supply go up and did interest rates go down? Well, let's just take a quick look. We know housing prices went down during the Great Recession. That's kind of what precipitated, right, this reduction in wealth, reduction in spending. But what happened to prices? Well, prices are going to be in blue here, right? Kind of had this little ramp up and then big drop, right? Big drop. What happened to output? Output went down as well. That's price and output going down, right? That was that first question. How did the government respond? Well, what you see here in red is you see taxes. Taxes kind of, they were going up, but then they started to flatten out a little bit. And you can really compare it to government expenditures. Those really started to pump up during that Great Recession time period as the government increased G. So the government responded exactly like we would expect them to when there's this AD shock. Well, what about the Federal Reserve? Well, they had kind of been messing with the interest rate beforehand, right? Going up and down, right? Then they're like, oh, geez, we got to make this go down, right? And so they quickly increase the money supply. That's M1 right here, this blue line, and we've got this interest rate going down, right? So we can look at these graphs in such a different way than we did 10 weeks ago, right? You can see, you can sense those graphs going on in the background. They're not overly complicated. It's just the Fed changing that money supply, dropping that interest rate, and trying to lift up spending, right? They're reacting to this right here, right? And they're reacting exactly appropriately, right? So this is really neat to see, and I think it's fun to see it all kind of come together, right? Again, with such a fairly straightforward model, okay? So those are demand shocks, right? Now, it would be incomplete to finish the course without talking about supply shocks, right? So let's just real quickly talk about supply shocks, right? Because this is going to have a little bit of a nuance and kind of leave. It's going to be like the cliffhanger of the term, right? But the first thing I want to ask you is, we'll ask, what if a recession is caused by an AS shock? So what I'm asking here is, yeah, it's fine. We can start to say, okay, this is how we respond to a demand shock. But how do we know if we have a demand shock versus a supply shock? So first thing you want to do in assessing this question is you want to say, okay, well, let's put ourselves in just we'll say a full employment equilibrium where we're at AD bar and we're at Y bar here. So there's AS bar, there's Y bar, there's Z bar, and we'll call it just P bar, okay? So we start here, and it'll come up eventually, right? We start here, and we say, start at Z bar, Y bar, P bar. A recession means that Y is less than Y bar. Okay, so if Y is less than Y bar, we're in a recession, but what else do we need to know to essentially conclude that we're in this aggregate supply or supply-driven recession, okay? I'm going to ask you guys this question real quickly, and then I'm going to close my windows too. So, all right, give this a go here. All right, see what you guys get. All right. So for the sake of time, I'll open this back up, right? But what we can do, right, is we can say, all right, we're down here. I'll put this in a different color. We're down here at Y2. Okay, we're down here at Y2 because we're in a recession, right? So that means that we're at Y2, which is less than Y bar. That's our final outcome. But if aggregate supply is what's caused this, that means that aggregate supply shifted, and it had to shift left, right? It can't shift right, because if it shifts right, we're going to be over at a higher level of Y. So AS had to shift, it shifted left. Okay, so if AS shifts left, where do we end up? Well, we end up right here at AS2. So there's our, oh, there we go. I'm going to move it. Going to move it. There we go. So we're here at Y2. We're at Z2. What happened to prices? prices went up to P2. Okay, so when we say, okay, well, how do we know that a recession is driven by an aggregate supply shock? Well, prices had to change. How did they change? They changed by going up, right? They changed by going up. So we got the majority getting this right, right? So that's great. It's great to see, right? And we can summarize this by saying, when we have this aggregate supply decrease, what happens? We have inflation because P2 is greater than P1, and a stagnant economy, right? Because Y2 is less than Y bar. I should put some bars over that P as well, okay? So we've got a stagnant economy plus inflation. The Hollywood couple version of this is what you hear in the news sometimes, which is stagflation. And this is something that's starting to become an issue today. It's an issue, and it was an issue in the past in the 1970s, and we'll talk about how the government responded to that. But ultimately, we're in a situation where we have output a little bit lower than we'd like, but then we're starting to see prices rise. This feels like the worst of both worlds. Okay, this feels like the worst of both worlds, right? So we need to ask ourselves, how should policymakers respond, right? So how should policymakers respond? Well, ideally, they would shift AS back to AS bar, right? Just like with AD, right? AD went down, just shift it back, right? AD goes up, just shift it back, right? Just move that AD curve back to AD bar, right? But what's the problem, right? Policymakers cannot shift AS, right? Their only tool is to shift AD, okay? So now when we look at this, right, we can say, all right, well, we're faced with this stagflation situation. So what should the government do? They can go ahead and they can try to fight different different goals, right? They can try to achieve different goals, and let's talk about that, right? So they can't just fight unemployment and fight the price level, the inflation at the same time, because if they could, they would just move AS back to there. All they can do is they can move AD to the right or to the left, and they're going to have to sacrifice something along the way, okay? So let's look at option one. So they're looking at prices going up, and they're looking at this output going down, and they say, just for example, let's fight unemployment. What should they do? What is the response of the Federal Reserve if they want to fight unemployment, right, and bring the economy back to Y bar? Okay, this is a tough question, right? But you have the tools to do it. You know what the Federal Reserve can do, right? There's a negative supply shock. They decide they want to get back to Y bar. Should they go out? Should they buy bonds? Should they sell bonds? Or should they ask Congress for advice? Or do nothing? All right. So I'm going to keep this open, right? But for the sake of time, right? Just talk through this with you. For those of you guys still working on it, just have it in the back of your mind here, right? So we've got this shock to the economy, right? That's caused prices to rise and output to fall. We go from Y bar to Y2, P bar to P2, Z bar to Z2, all right? The Fed says, okay, well, what can we do? We can control that AD curve, right? We can move that AD curve to the right or to the left, right? And by doing that, there'll be certain responses to that, or there'll be certain consequences to that, right? So in this case, they say, all right, well, we want to fight unemployment. We really care about unemployment. That seems to matter the most right now, right? That's what we decide, all right? So in that case, all right, we've got to get Y bar as our equilibrium, right? So we got to have Y bar as our equilibrium, but we can't change AS2, okay? So we're going to stay on AS2, right? But Y bar has to be our equilibrium. So that means, right, if we just graph this out, we'd say we got to be actually right here. We'll call it Z3, right? We got to be at Z3. So Z3 is that top dot there, right? Well, how do we get to that dot? All we've got to do is we've got to increase AD. So what we can do is we can break this question down into how does the Fed increase AD? Well, all the Fed needs to do is go out. They need to buy bonds, increase that money supply, decrease the interest rate, increase AE, and increase AD. That will move us to Z3. Okay, so let's see what you guys said here, right? What do we do when we see this really tough situation, right? This is a confusing thing, right? Because what you might have been saying is like, I don't like this, right? I don't like this response. So you're kind of like, maybe I should buy a bond, but I feel like I should sell them. I'm not quite sure, right? So what you've done is you've said, look, we care about unemployment more than the price level. So now we're going to get ourselves back to Y bar, even though prices have already increased, right? What we're going to do as policymakers is say we care more about people losing jobs than that price increase. We're going to end up all the way at P3, but then we're going to get back to Y bar. There's a clear trade-off here, right? There's a clear trade-off here, right? So what happens in the end? We've got some jobs that are saved, right? Some jobs are saved, right? So I'm just going to pick on the folks that are in the chat because I got some names, right? So imagine that we go from Y bar to Y2 and Alina loses her job, right? Alina loses her job when we go to Y2. But then we say, you know what we're going to do, right? All of us are going to come together and we're going to go ahead and we're going to all increase the prices. We're all going to pay higher prices and Alina's going to get her job back. She's going to go from Y2 to Y bar, all right? So some jobs are saved, right? But everyone pays higher prices, right? Everyone pays higher prices to save those jobs. So price level 3, P3, is greater than P2, but Y2 goes back to Y bar. This is a non-aggressive policy, right? This is a non-aggressive policy, right? This is something that seems kind of like everybody's chipping in to help Alina, right? We're all as a group saying we don't want her to lose her job, right? This is kind of that safe, non-aggressive policy. It's also called a dove policy, right? A dove policy, right? Because I guess doves are less aggressive than other birds. I feel like doves are kind of just in your face when you go sit at a restaurant, but whatever, right? When you hear the term dovish or dove policy, what it's essentially saying is that we care more about jobs than we do pricing, okay? But that's not the only option the Fed has, right? So let's redo this and let's look at option number 2, right? So option 1, we can fight unemployment, save Alina's job, and we're all set, right? But with option number 2, maybe the Fed decides they want to keep prices stable, okay? So they want to get P2 back to P bar, okay? So my question for you, right, is, and you can guess what this question is going to be, right? The Fed wants to bring prices back to this original level of P, right? What should they do? right? What should the Fed do in order to make this happen? Okay, give this a try. This is the last question of the term. I'm going to draw this out with you guys. Yes, the answer before was buy bonds. Sorry about that. Yes, the answer before was buy bonds. All right, I'm drawing this with you. Oh, coming. Perfect. You guys are working on it. It's good. That's funny. That came up quick. I got into the question. Perfect. Okay. So I'm gonna just keep let this question go, right? As I talk about it here, right? And you guys have been working on it, and then you can start to answer the question, right? We're still getting hundreds of answers here. Okay. So, right, we want to get P2 back to P bar, right? That just happens to be what we decided as the Federal Reserve. What that means is we need to get P2, right, to P bar, but we need to stay on this AS2 curve, okay? So that means that our new equilibrium is going to be at Z4, right? So our new equilibrium is at Z4. How does the Fed get there? They've got to reduce or decrease AD. So we go from AD bar to A, we'll call it AD. Actually, I'll be consistent here and say AD4, okay? AD4, all right? All right, so now we got to decrease this AD curve, right? How can the Fed decrease AD? Well, let's see if you guys are, I think, is the Fed ready to hire you? Let's see. I think the Fed's ready to hire you because if the Fed goes out and sells bonds, that will decrease AD, right? So if we think about what that final outcome is, right? Well, now all of a sudden, right, prices are stable, right? So if we think about just the general process here is that Alina lost her job, right? When we went from Y bar to Y2, everybody paid kind of higher prices as a whole, right? And then we said, you know what, we're going to pay even higher prices before, right? And then we'll save Alina's job. But what we decided here is that, look, prices are stable, so everyone benefits, but Y3 is less than Y2. More jobs are lost, right? So Alina lost her job when we went from Y bar to Y2, but now Andreas is going to lose his job, right? When we go from Y2 to Y3, right? Because now we're saying, hey, let's decrease spending. Prices will be constant, right? Everybody benefits, but more jobs are lost. So we sacrifice jobs to keep prices stable. This is an aggressive policy. So if you're aggressive with this, right, essentially we're saying, hey, we care more about our price level than the jobs. This is an aggressive policy. This is also called a hawk policy. So when you hear the terms hawk and dove, this is what the Fed is referring to, right? Saying, hey, do we care about prices or do we care about jobs? If we sacrifice jobs for prices, that is aggressive. That is a hawk policy. And so when we think about what the Fed has done in the past, when they've been faced with this was in the early 70s, This graph kind of says it all, that we actually don't know what to do, right? We had a reduction in output, an increase in prices. The Fed responded to this in the 1970s by increasing the interest rate, or essentially moving AD bar to AD4. And then they're like, oh, geez, that's not good. We got to go ahead and we got to decrease that interest rate. We got to increase AD because job loss is going to really be harmful in this case, right? So what we can see here is that aggregate supply shocks are not as easy as demand shocks. We have these hawk and dove policies that essentially say that there is a trade-off between prices and jobs, right? Between prices and jobs, okay? And so, and I've got a couple other things in here that talk about the Fed and what they're doing today, and you guys can look at all that stuff. They're meeting on December 14th and 15th next week. This, you can see their response to the pandemic. That was an aggregate demand shock, huge crash in the federal funds rate. We see it right here. Got to tell you guys, I know I'm out of time. We could keep talking for a long time, but like I said, there's gonna be a review session Saturday afternoon. Final exam is gonna be on Thursday, 11:30 to, it should be 2:30. You guys will have the full time. You're gonna have 50 questions, gonna be on top hat, all that stuff. I'll send out announcements about that. I also will update the grades. Make sure you guys have more tools than I think you guys give yourself credit for. The review session will be Saturday. I'll send out more information about that. But I want you guys going out. I want you applying for jobs. The market is needing folks that are quality workers, that are great people, that know how to maneuver lots of different scenarios. You guys are that generation. Go make that happen. Don't be afraid to apply. Don't be afraid to talk to me about it in the future. I want to see you guys in the future in a future class. I want you to be safe and watch out for Omicron or whatever variant we're going to be on in the next few years. So take care of yourself. I will see you guys on campus soon. This isn't the end. All right, we'll see you guys soon. Thank you guys so much. You guys are great. Thank you. Wow, this is like a lot of thanks. Jeez. Oh, wow. This is too much, guys. This is too much. It's been fun, guys. Keep coming back. Thanks, guys. You guys were a great class. This was awesome. Don't be afraid to stop me in the campus here. Thanks, Carla. We made it work, right? We made it work. Yes, I do have office hours today. I'll be there. No class on Tuesday. This is it.